What's the difference between you and a rock? Are stars alive? Is a computer virus a living being? These may seem like easy or even obvious questions, but scientists struggle to formulate a universal definition of life. And it's far more challenging than you might think to draw a line of distinction between life and non-life. Can life even be defined? And is it even helpful to try? Tonight, we're going to address these questions with our two amazing guest scientists in a moderated discussion led by our own Molly Bentley. So good evening, finally, ladies and gentlemen and SETI Institute friends the world over. Thanks for joining us tonight for SETI Talk, Can We Define Life and Should We? And thanks for your patience. SETI Talks is a production of the SETI Institute and is made possible by the generous support of people like you. And tonight's talk is sponsored by Wendy Zhang. Wendy is a business development and strategic partnerships leader for the Silicon Valley startup Yo Labs, and she's a member of the board of trustees of the SETI Institute. So now, just a brief word from our sponsor. Wendy?
Hi, everyone. I first got to know SETI when I was in middle school after watching a documentary about all the amazing science and research that the Institute has been working on. And that was the first moment in my life when I became absolutely obsessed with science. And one of the first questions that came into my mind as I was watching the documentary and learning more about all of the research that's behind the scenes was, well, what is life? How did I come here? And what other life is there? And so I was thrilled to see that we have two amazing scholars, as well as Molly Bentley, who, as you all probably know from Big Picture Science, hosts a session. And I am so thrilled to be able to be a part and to support the Institute that has been giving me a lot of great things to think about, especially during the pandemic. And I've been attending the monthly SETI talks since, and I just think it's such a great way for us to kind of get outside of our homes right now and to think more broadly about all the spectacular mysteries in the universe. So thank you for all being here, and absolutely love the Institute and encourage you all to also look into all the vast diversity of things that the SETI Institute does, and to also help support. Thank you. And over to Molly.
Thanks, Wendy. Now I want to see if I can borrow a few minutes, since we were slow in getting up and running here. Do I have a few minutes at the end, Bill and all the powers that be?
Yes, Molly, I think, as long as our very generous and patient guests don't mind, as far as I'm concerned, take a few more minutes. We don't want to stop any of the exciting conversation that's about to happen.
That sounds great. Well, I'll tell you, I thought that our discussion tonight was going to be difficult, but it turns out it might be a piece of cake compared with trying to get the Zoom video working. I am Molly Bentley. I am the executive producer of the SETI Institute's radio show and podcast, Big Picture Science, and it is truly my pleasure to introduce our guest tonight. Haley Sapers is a research associate in planetary exploration and astrobiology and the interim director of the Planetary Volatiles Laboratory at York University in Toronto, Canada, from where she joins us tonight, I believe. She studies microbial communities that we think would be the sort of living organisms that we might find on Mars. She is interested in the role of meteorite impact cratering in creating and maintaining habitable places for life on Earth and possibly on Mars. She is also a visiting astrobiologist at the California Institute of Technology, where her work includes studying microbial communities deep below the surface at the Sanford Underground Research Facility in South Dakota. And this might give you claustrophobia to think of it, because it is a mine that is almost 5,000 feet deep. Haley was once asked whether a rock is living or non-living thing. She judged it to be a trick question, and we'll find out why. Welcome, Haley.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here and part of this discussion.
We're great. We're very happy to have you. Carol Cleland is a philosopher of science, and she is the director of the Center for the study of origins at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She was a member of the NASA Astrobiology Institute for at least a decade. She is a current SETI Institute affiliate, has published many papers on and or has written extensively about the nature and origin of life, the search for extant and extinct extraterrestrial life, I like to call it the triple E, and the possibility of a shadow biosphere, a term which she coined and which I hope that she'll define for us tonight. Shadow biosphere sounds a little noir. It is more than a little intriguing. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, tonight's question was going to be, what is life? And while that seems like a straightforward one, here's how complicated it is, because this SETI talk almost didn't happen, and not for the technical difficulties with Zoom. And I'm going to give you, audience, a peek behind the scenes here. In our back and forth emails between the SETI Institute staff and Carol and Haley about tonight's proposed discussion, what is life, Carol replied to say that the whole project of defining life is a mistake and ought to be abandoned. Okay, so we agreed to reframe it to the questions, can we define life and should we? So Carol, let's begin with you. I assume we don't have to say goodbye right now. We can continue this conversation because we framed it correctly. Why do you find the question, what is life, so fraught?
Well, it represents a misunderstanding of the nature of definitions, the logic of definitions. So not to go into too much detail, but definitions are about language and concepts. So the classic definition in every introductory logic text is bachelor. And how you define bachelor is unmarried human male, and you worry about the Pope and about infant males. But the important thing is what you're doing there is you're not getting outside your head. What you're trying to do is figure out what the word bachelor means, in this case, English, and there's equivalents in other languages, what the word bachelor means to us. And when you really ask the question, what is life? Or what is water? Or, what is, a star? You don't really care about our current concept. What you're really interested in is getting out of that concept and knowing what it is in itself. An astrobiologist is not interested in knowing what we currently think life is. An astrobiologist is interested in what life really is, what fungi, fish, opossums, elephants, tigers, redwood trees all have in common. And our current concept could be badly mistaken, particularly since.
So part of it is the terminology, just the language that we're using. We've already put ourselves into a box that maybe limited our ability to see on the other side of that. Haley, do you find the question, what is life, similarly controversial?
I do, and I think it lies in what's nicely summed up in a quote by John Adams. Chaos was the law of nature and order was the dream of man. And nature likes to exist in these continuums, and scientists like to put nature in these discrete little boxes. And
Haley, can you say that again? Just repeat that quotation for us again.
Sure, the quotation is, chaos was the law of nature and order was the dream of man. And nature likes to exist in this continuum, and scientists like to put nature in these discrete little boxes. And definitions are the boundaries of those discrete little boxes. And life is kind of a phenomenon that exists along a continuum. It's almost impossible to put your finger on a discrete moment in time that represents the origin of life, where we can say everything before this point, life did not exist, and everything after this point was touched or affected by life. And because that was a process. And I think the definition of life really negates that continuum aspect.
It's so interesting because I think we all have intuitively, we feel like we understand what life is, but what you're saying is that if you have a singular definition, what that requires then is a list of criteria, and then you have to go down and check off the criteria, and then it's binary, yes or no, and it's more complicated than that. And Haley, I know you draw an analogy to trying to define music, and could you explain for us how that analogy works?
Sure. So just for a moment, entertain the question, what is the single smallest collection of notes or the single smallest fraction of a sound that you can hear before your brain interprets it as music. And if you're in a concert hall and you're waiting for a piece of music to begin and you're expecting music, that very first single smallest fraction of a sound, your brain would probably interpret as music. But if you were out on the street, that exact same very single smallest fraction of a sound, your brain would probably interpret as noise. And so here we have two concepts, this idea of a continuum. So how do you get from a single sound to a piece of music, but also this idea of context. Where you are, where you're hearing that sound is really important to how you interpret it. And how you
and certainly that's true if you're in a John Cage concert and the concert is silence, and yet it's being performed.
So can I just,
Carol, yeah, please, can you get in there? Haley's talking about this idea of context. What is your reaction to that?
So let me just get back to the idea of music, because I think you're familiar with Four Doolittles. It's the song, not it's a song, not the singer that matters. Are you familiar with Four Doolittle's writings on that? Because it sounds like you are. You have to be careful with your analogies. Now, it's certainly true that in some sorts of things in the world are continuous, and you can't draw that kind of, shall we say, barrier, separating it out. But other things aren't. Take a quartz crystal. That's silicon dioxide. A quartz crystal is much less continuous than, say, other things. So you can't conclude that everything in nature is continuous. There's a certain stage at which, of course, it's forming, but the stage in which it's forming is not necessarily when the thing is actually quartz. There's a certain transition that occurs. So you have to be careful, I think, in making those analogies, given how little we know about the origin of life. I mean, maybe it is a continuum. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's much more like a switch is thrown and suddenly,
or like a phase change into something else.
A really good example. Like take a tornado. You could say that a tornado is continuous, but there's a certain stage at which it's definitely a tornado, another stage in which it's just kind of a thunderstorm with circulation. And so you want to be careful with your analogies, because sometimes they're correct and sometimes they aren't. But I think we know so little about the origin of life that I would not want to talk about it being continuum at this stage. I think there is a chemical process that takes us from abiotic or non-living chemistry to life, but I don't know whether or not, there's a continuum where it's partially alive and then more alive and then finally alive, or alive the whole time, or whether or not, it's like a switch that gets thrown. So I take
it back. Actually, trying to get video to work on Zoom is easier than coming up with a definition for life.
There's another problem with definitions, so be very careful. Definitions are completely compartmentalized.
Yes.
They give you necessary and sufficient conditions, and even in logic, like trying to define bachelor, you have problems. The only time in which you really get those nice, clean definitions with necessary and sufficient conditions is in, say, mathematics. And there it's just by stipulation.
Because let's go into some examples that people can, unless Haley wants to respond to that.
Can I just give you an example?
Well, actually, no, let me move on here a little bit, because I think this is quite abstract and it's profound in that. But let's start with a point of reference for everyone. About what life as we know it has in common, just so we can all imagine life as we know it. So if for Carol and Haley, if I give you, if I mention some living organisms that we can all agree are living, maybe you can tell us what they share, just so we can talk about, get an idea of the sort of terms we're talking about here. So if we have elephants and trees and humans and mice and jellyfish, okay, just as a sample, what do they have in common?
I think one of the important things that they have in common is they adapt and respond to their environment. So there's an evolutionary history associated with them. They take in, their energy transducers, so they take in energy in some form and convert it to mass. They grow or they reproduce, and then their offspring carry a component of information that was passed on or inherited from the parents in those examples.
Okay, so adapt and respond, traits that are inherited. Carol, do you want to add to that list?
Well, I mean, the list you gave are all multicellular eukaryotes. These are complex organisms that didn't appear in life on Earth until less than 1 billion years ago. So, so they're going to have more in common than with a microbe.
Right, but they were the list that we were given.
But I'm just pointing out that that shows a kind of eukaryote-centric or plant animal.
But it's interesting because what I'm getting at is just to get some very, very basic commonalities instead of talking about the outliers. And I honestly thought that you might say they all need water, they all have certain chemical elements, and they have an energy source, because that tends to be the basic definition or the ingredient list for life. Am I wrong
the
about that?
ingredient list is not the same thing as the description of what makes something which uses those ingredients life. So that ingredient list is also an ingredient list, I think, for for pyrite, a rock that has been altered by water. So you have to be very careful with ingredient lists because there's lots of non-living things that have that ingredient list.
Right.
So if you want to list, the things that Haley lists are general enough, they apply to microbes. That's why I liked her list. And I think that, on Earth, you have to have, we have carbon chemistry, we have, and probably all life involves extracting energy from the environment and maintaining itself. I have doubts about how, whether Darwinian evolution is a necessary condition for life, because you can imagine environments in which the environment didn't change very much, and mutation would be disadvantageous because things would already become very well adapted, and then they wouldn't change much. So if we're going to if we're asking what is life, which is not just about our Earth life, we want to ask about what is life in the universe as a whole. I think we're being not only are we being Earth-centric, but the list of things you gave us, Molly, were even on Earth outliers, because there are things that are less than 1 billion years old. They're they lack the diversity of the microbial community, et cetera. So,
right. And so now we see why this is so tricky, but it was a way to just create a point of reference for people who are not thinking maybe beyond, have not yet begun to think beyond some of those definitions. I want to follow up just quickly, and then I'm going to grab a pen because this pen just ran out. But Carol, can you give me an example of something that is living that has not responded to evolution?
No, but that's here on Earth, right? I mean, the issue is here on Earth, evolution plays an important role. Why? Because Earth is in a Goldilocks position. The Earth changes, but it doesn't change so fast that it drives everything extinct, which could happen. I mean, it could be all life on Earth would have been driven extinct. It has, certainly faced things like the 66 million years ago in Cretaceous extinctions, and there were even worse extinctions in the Permian. So it has faced extinction. But if some of this stuff is big enough and nasty enough, then you could wipe off all life on Earth. So what I'm trying to make here, I know I'm not saying what you want me to say, but
no, yes, you are. That's okay.
The important thing here is that, we're in a Goldilocks position for Darwinian evolution. Why? Because it doesn't change so fast that you can't have, and by the way, the creatures that you mentioned, the eukaryotes, mostly reproduced by parent to offspring with mutations. That's a much slower process than microbes use, with their ability to actually transfer genes directly from one microbe to another. So they're better adapted for the need for fast evolution, which is one of the reasons I think they survive. So,
well, Carol has taken us off life, and off the planet, and we're going to come back to that and talk about alien
I'm talking
life.
about the planet right now. I'm just saying that
she has to, okay, let me be precise. I see that precision is, we were talking about the planet and then we went off the planet and we came back to the planet. But Carol, here, I'm going to throw you a big one in it briefly.
Go ahead, I'm ready.
You could explain to us why it is that a conversation about life, which so far seems like it's a biological discussion, it's about chemicals. What are you are a philosopher of science. What are the tools of philosophy that you can bring, that one brings? Or maybe I should say, what do the tools of philosophy bring to examining the question, can we define life? And coming up for the audience is going to be a poll. So hold on to your hats or your seats or whatever you hold on to. We will have a poll question in a moment. But just briefly, Carol, what does philosophy bring to this conversation?
Logic, the nature of definition. the nature of definition. So people who try to define life often ignore the fact you have to have necessary conditions. They take the word definition and they use it in non-standard ways, which are logically impermissible. And if you actually look, so there are philosophers of language who have studied, the way in which two different kinds of terms in our language work, which are, there are what we call artificial or conventional kind terms. Life is a kind term. There are many different things that fit it. And bachelor is one of those. And definitions work great for that, except there are, again, always borderline cases. All definitions have borderline cases, but they aren't really problematic because they handle the cases that are that we are really secure about, like 30-year-old bachelors and newborn babies. So that those cases are not problematic. But if you look at the history of science, what we call natural kind terms, water, Aristotle thought water was an element, an indivisible element. And so if you tried to define water back 2,000 years ago, and actually his views continued all the way until basically the work of Lavoisier at the late in the late 18th century, believe it or not, then you would have defined it as something very different than you would later with the discovery of the periodic table in the 19th century. H2O is now what we think water is, but then there are problems with H2O.
So our own definitions in some ways sort of encumber this discussion, and we need someone to come in with the logic to help frame it. Well, let's look at some of the ways in which that our definition of life has fooled us. And we're going to do that in a moment with some specific examples, but we do have a poll for the audience. And let's see if we can get it up here on the screen. And if it doesn't pop up on the screen, I will go ahead and read it to you. The poll, which should be forthcoming, is which one of these things is definitely not alive? Okay, definitely not alive. And the audience should see this poll now. 0% of you have voted. Okay, now the votes are coming in. Virus, rock, AI, fire, none of the above, all of the above. So again, virus, rock, AI, fire, and boy, are the answers coming in really fast. Haley, just food for thought here. As the audience answers this poll, I really like this poll, by the way, because it really plays on our assumptions. When you were in 7th grade, and I mentioned this, but I didn't mention you were in 7th grade. When you were in 7th grade, you were asked by the teacher, I think it was a teacher in exam, is a rock alive or is it non-living? And you thought it was a trick question. Why? And how did you answer?
I did. I assumed it was a trick question, and I thought about this rock, and I thought about the rock cycle, and I thought about the very myopic definition of life the textbook presented. And the textbook defined life as reproducing, growing, taking in energy. And I thought, the rock cycle and minerals and mineral growth, it satisfies, it checks all of those boxes. And I thought about, a fossil that was alive. And so if it was alive, how could it be non-living? And so I figured this was a trick question designed to trap us and teach us about the perils and pitfalls of trying to define a phenomenon that's inherently perhaps indefinable. And I confidently circled not alive. I, of course, got the question very wrong, but that really began my fascination with this idea of life and what it means to be alive, non-living, or dead. And so I thought about, you've got this pyrite crystal, and each one of these little tiny crystals that's growing on here is a template, and it carries all of the information it needs to form a new crystal. And you have crystal defects that form, that change in response to changes in the environment. And those crystal defects lead to slightly different variations of those minerals that form. And so I was thinking about all of this in trying to answer the question. And I think it's still a question that I don't have an exact answer to.
And tell me again, you circled, just make sure I heard that you circled alive or not alive back then?
I circled that a rock was alive.
Was alive, and that prompted some questions from your teacher.
Certainly did.
Well, so for Carol and Haley, I wonder if you both could give us an example or another example of something that has fooled us, that has pushed our definition of the boundaries of, excuse me, that has pushed, rather has pushed the boundaries of our definition of life. And maybe we'll go to Haley again in a moment, but Carol, do you have an example of something that's fooled us and challenged us?
Well, there is no one definition of life.
I think
So
that's been established.
it depends on which definition you happen to be supporting, how you're going to classify things. Like take virus. On a Darwinian definition, viruses would be classified as alive. But then biologists always kind of cheat because their Darwinian definitions and their metabolic definitions don't include being enclosed by a cell, but they all think that the cellular basis of life is critical. So they kind of cheat and say, well, yeah, it does Darwinian evolution, but it's not enclosed. The genetic material is not enclosed by a legitimate cell, just a protein coat. So then they say it's not alive. But of course, that's how definitions are completely ignored when you have these various biases. So technically, if you really accept the Darwinian definition of life, it's very hard not to classify a virus as alive. If your definition, on the other hand, is metabolic, it's very hard to classify it as alive. But then you have to worry about hurricanes and tornadoes and candle flames, all of which extract energy from their environment to maintain their organization. And a hurricane lasts a lot longer than a mayfly, which lasts for one day. So, a hurricane maintains its organization, extracting all this energy from the ocean and from the atmosphere to maintain itself. So technically, on a metabolic definition, it's really hard to rule out a hurricane as alive. And I'll give you a really fun example from history. As late as the 18th century, people argued that the stars were living things. Why? Even Kant wondered about this, but he rejected it. But up until that time, it was a live debate because people believed that objects, as they do on Earth, cease moving, that the natural state is a state of rest. So why is it that the stars and the planets keep moving? What's keeping them moving? On a notion of life, which was certainly popular before Newton, that motion is critical to life. And Aristotle defined one of his critical aspects of life was the ability to be self-moving. The planets and stars look like they're alive.
It's interesting what you say about viruses, and I want to come to the Haley's example in a moment. Although one other thing, which is this is a good time to write in questions. If you have some audience, you just press I'm sure you all know where it is, but there's a button down there. Maybe it's not a button, it's a thing down there at the bottom of your screen, and you can write in your question. The debate about viruses, and I don't want to continue it now because there are so many other questions, but one could argue either side, as Carol said, that a virus is alive and a virus is not alive. And those two sides are just not finding common ground. And so if anyone in the audience wants to read more about this, it really is a rich discussion that you have among the oldest viruses are among the oldest organisms on Earth, and yet they evade our definition of life. Well, coming back to Carol's idea about like a tornado or something like this makes me think about fire, because here in California, of course, if you were to look at the fires from far away, they might look intelligent. I mean, they consume a lot of energy. They seem to be malevolent. They seem to maybe even have agency. If you didn't know anything about life on this planet, maybe fire would be that way. Haley, what's your example of something that has fooled us and pushed the boundaries of our definition of life?
When I think about pushing the boundaries and why we struggle with the definition of life, I think about the discovery of hydrothermal vents. In February in 1977, there was a voyage about 400 miles off the coast of South America, where a group of scientists piloted a robotic vehicle 8,000 feet beneath the ocean surface. And they were looking at these pictures. And there was not a biologist on that team of scientists because it was inconceivable that life could exist on the ocean floor. And what they found was a thriving ecosystem. They found life as it could never have been imagined. And this really redefined what it meant, what habitability meant, what life meant. And for me, I see this really as when, how can we, searching for life as we don't know it really became plausible. So here was this ecosystem with these incredible animals and these incredible life forms that existed completely separate from the sun and had metabolisms that were never envisioned before. And I think that really is quite an incredible moment in understanding the extent of life just here on Earth.
Not being able to imagine what we would find on there. I see Carol is shaking her head. Carol, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I don't think this challenged any definition of life. It certainly gave us knowledge about living things that are very different than and live in environments that we'd never dreamt that they could live in. So the extent of life on Earth, Haley is exactly right. But it didn't challenge the idea of Darwinian evolution or metabolism. Note, by the way, these are two different definitions. So when you talk about challenging our definition, which one do you mean? And these things didn't challenge. No, I'm not challenging you, Haley. I was just saying that the way Molly presented it was what our definition. And the question is, which one do you mean? And it doesn't challenge any of those. These organisms, they have the same DNA, the same kind of proteins, 20 amino acids, 4 nucleotide bases. They have the same chemical makeup and organization as stuff on the surface. They're just adapted to this really extreme environment. So I don't think it challenged our definition of life. It certainly challenged, and Haley's quite right about this, the extent of where you could find life on Earth. There's almost no place on Earth you don't find it. You find it in Antarctica. You can find it in the Atacama Desert. It's the driest places on Earth.
But doesn't the discovery of extremophiles, organisms, often microbes that live in extreme environments, so either highly acidic environments or really high temperature environments, does that not challenge our understanding of what life is or what it's capable of? No, because again, extremophiles, archaea, which actually were thought initially to be the only extremophile, but now we find them in your nose and everywhere. But they're kind of bacteria-like thing, and they're not genetically different from us. They undergo Darwinian evolution. They metabolize. So all of the things that we are familiar with on Earth that we know so far are just like us. They're just really weird looking, and they occupy environments that we never thought in many cases life could actually occupy. Like I don't know, Haley probably knows the answer to this. I don't know how hot they've been able to find environments that I think they're up to, do you know how hot at the latest? They're very hot. I mean, they can occupy.
Well over 120 degrees now.
Over 120 degrees, yeah. Now that's amazing. They're doing this with the same DNA, the same RNA. They have more of I believe, the cytosine, thymine, CT, which is 3 hydrogen bonds. So they're a little more stable against a kind of kinetic energy of boiling water, but it's the same basic, same 4 nucleotide bases, same, they evolved by Darwinian means. They metabolize in the same way.
Mm-hmm. So they may be unique to us, but they don't challenge that definition of life. I see that many people are writing in with questions, and we're going to ask questions at the end of this, and we're getting to that. But let's move on to the search for extraterrestrial life. And why is the question of can we define life critical in the search for alien life? And I'll let either one of you jump in with that.
Sure. So I think there's this idea of biogenicity and of a biosignature. And so are we looking for life? Are we looking for what life leaves behind? I mean, we had, there's the famous quote by Carl Sagan that extraordinary evidence or extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And it's very hard to look for something if you don't know exactly what it is that you're looking for. But that doesn't require a definition, because a definition can be myopic, it can be restrictive, and it can lead to missing things. Mm-hmm. And so I'd like to take the audience maybe just on a little thought experiment here, and I'm going to give you a grocery list. And this grocery list is a mission. And so you go into a grocery store and come out with what I'm describing. So I have milk, eggs, zucchini, and flour. So that's the grocery list, and you're on a mission to find what that describes. And I've heard many answers. I've heard salad and quiches and focaccia, but really I'm describing a chocolate zucchini cake. And that list is a metaphor for our myopic view of how we understand life on Earth, because that list is missing a key ingredient. It's missing chocolate. How do we know we're not missing some key ingredient to life as we don't know it? It also
and that's it. Just to repeat that phrase. So when we look for life off of Earth, when we look for alien life, we may very well be looking for life as we do not know it. Is that right? That's the point.
Yes.
So I have something to say about this. So one of the things I think is, one of the reasons I think people want a definition of life is it gives you a quick answer, thumbs up or thumbs down, necessary and sufficient conditions. It either is or it isn't. If it meets the necessary and sufficient condition, it's life. If it fails to meet any of them, it's not life. It makes it really simple. You can go out there. NASA wants quick answers so it can tell the public we did or did not find life. This is, if you look at the Viking missions in the 1970s, that was the great hope. They went with the metabolic definition. Now, the favorite NASA definition is the chemical Darwinian definition. So they switch definitions to show you the risk of switching definitions. But the important thing here is that they want a quick answer. And I think the problem is we need to get away from this idea that if it's really different than life as we know it, that we're going to have a quick answer. We're going to have the question, is this really more like a tornado or a hurricane? Or is it really
to be fair to NASA, if NASA wanted a quick answer, I don't think they would launch missions that take many, many, many years. They're some of the most patient scientists around, but we hear what you're saying. So Carol, it sounds like we really, if we're going to go looking for life, we have to look for, we have to broaden our understanding of what it could be. I wonder if you could now give us a definition of the shadow biosphere. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Would you mind?
A little, though. I do have a proposal, which I've written about, for how you should look for life. And it's looking for potentially biological anomalies, things that shouldn't be there, using tentative versus defining criteria. And those tentative criteria can be based on familiar Earth life, but they are not taken as definitive. That is to say,
can you give us an example? Can you give us an example of something we might find that isn't life, but something that shouldn't be there?
Well, I think that's the whole challenge, right? Because we haven't found anything like that.
But Carol, isn't there the possibility if you broaden this definition so wide, then there's okay, if you broaden this so much so it's just something that shouldn't be there, is that also equally unhelpful?
No, but I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying that we take Darwinian evolution as a tentative criterion. It's not the only one. We take metabolic characteristics. We maybe look for structural complexity. We look for amino acids. If we get enough positive, pings on our list, then we say, oh, this system is really interesting. It's potentially biological. But you don't have to get all the pings on your list in order for it to be potentially biological. Then it has to be further investigated. And further investigating, it's going to take time. It's not like you're going to, with a definition, you get an instant gratification. And by the way, maybe now NASA's more tolerant and patient, but they weren't with the Viking missions. There was a huge, flurry of activity where they wanted a definitive answer, and the definitive answer where they didn't find life. And now they've gone back and looked at the data and they're saying, well, maybe we were too quick. So I think NASA has, for very good reasons, backed off on its initial plan, which was a metabolic definition, and the Viking missions were supposed to give you a quick answer. They weren't so patient in those days.
So I'll press this a little bit for something specific, but I understand if we haven't found it yet, it would be very hard to say what that is, although Carol gave some hints as to what we might be looking for example, complexity. Is there something that we would be interested in discovering on another world that doesn't meet our current definition of life? okay, that would nonetheless be a major discovery for astrobiologists and for the SETI Institute, for example. And you can be creative here. You can make up something if you want to, but I think it helps to have, if the audience could get a picture in their minds. Haley, I saw you nodding, so you get it. You get the attempt to answer that.
Well, I'm going to pick at something a little bit here for a change, and I think it's a little bit of a paradox, but I would say that a virus doesn't necessarily conform to our current definition of life. But I think finding a virus on another planet would paradoxically be evidence of life. Viruses require some sort of host, and in our current understanding of them, that host does meet our perhaps restrictive or myopic definition of life. And so just kind of twisting that a little bit, I would say that if we could definitively find a virus on another planet and definitively show that that was not contamination, that would be a pretty exciting moment for astrobiologists.
That's a great example. I think we can all relate to that one.
Very Earth-centric. Again, it's very Earth-centric. We're talking about viruses. We're talking about stuff we're familiar with. And that's the problem, because it's,
give us something that we're not familiar with. Give us something we're not familiar with. You can go wherever you want, anywhere you want.
No, but of course, if I could tell you something like that, then we would have found life on Mars. So an example would be findings that people have argued if you look at DNA and and you look at nucleic acids and proteins, what you see is a small, actually a not very large number of elements that are combined in repetitive ways, and they're actually form long polymers. So if you don't find those kinds of long polymers like that are hard to form under abiotic non-living circumstances. So if you found something on Titan like that, where you don't have water, we're talking about life as we don't know it, but you have liquid oceans of methane and ammonia, I think, isn't that right, Ailey? You would know. And if you found something like that, these complex polymers, and you had no biological explanation for it, then I think you'd have reason to, hey, we better go back and take a look.
Okay, that's a good example. That's another good example. I think that could help us picture. Haley, if we were not looking for alien life, okay, if we're not, if there were no SETI Institute, if we weren't looking for alien life, if no one was interested in whether or not there is life out there, would we be having this discussion about the definition of life, or could we just let it go?
I think
that's still need it.
Interesting question. And I think as we advance our understanding of life and life processes on Earth, I think we're pushing our understanding of what life is. And I think this circles back to the very first question you asked when I said that discovering that biosphere at the bottom of the ocean challenged the definition of life. And I think Carol didn't agree with that assessment because it didn't challenge our current definition of life. But in a way, it challenged our understanding of life, and it challenged our entire framework of what life was. And so I think that gets a little bit into the semantics of what we mean by a definition. And so I would say it's really important for us to continue developing the boundaries and this framework and how life exists, how it persists, how it manifests. But whether or not those are components that will lead us to a complete and holistic definition is, I think, more of a philosophical question. Is it important for humanity to have a complete holistic definition that encompasses all of what it means to be alive?
We mentioned that you work in the mine in North Dakota.
Yes.
And you've actually been down there. Have you come across anything, a microbe or anything where you just said, I don't, well, if I say microbe, then we know it's a microbe, but have you come across anything where you thought, I don't really know what this is?
Yeah, no, all the time. And it's one of the reasons I love what I do. So my thesis work was looking at these tiny tubules in impact glass, and we had no idea what these were. Were these biologic? Were they evidence of life? Was this microbial colonization? And it became very clear to me that this was almost an impossible question to answer. I could gather as much evidence as I could to determine their biogenicity, to determine that they were evidence of life. But determining biogenicity has two sides to it. You need to both determine that whatever it is that you're looking at, be it a possible cell or something that a possible cell left behind, was formed by life processes. But you also need to show that it could not have been formed by abiotic mechanisms. So you both have to show that it's plausible to be formed by life, and it was impossible to be formed by not life. And so those are those two sides of that question. And I'm constantly running into things where you kind of take a step back and have to think about it and the boundaries and, you know, what is this?
We're going to answer the poll question in a moment, and I just have one other question before a final question, and then we'll get to those audience questions. So if we can, if Carol and Haley can be somewhat brief about this, because I think we've established this is a very difficult endeavor. I want to look at the possible consequences now of a possibly inadequate definition of life. I'm trying to qualify this as much as possible. NASA's Mars 2020 mission is underway, and our goal is to learn whether or not life ever existed on Mars. And to that end, NASA's Perseverance rover is in the 30-mile wide Jezero crater, and it's collecting rock samples for analysis. Is it possible that the Perseverance rover might miss life's signature because what it's hunting for is not well defined, or because we have a very narrow definition or understanding of what we expect to find? So just briefly, both of you, could you address that? Because that's happening now.
So that's the advantage of tentative criteria rather than defining criteria, because now you've got not just the kinds of things you think are universal to life on Earth, metabolism and Darwinian evolution, but you throw in other things in your search criteria. You throw in things that might be unique to certain kinds of environments that life has found on Earth. You throw in, for example, these little magnetotactic bacteria pack in these little strings of magnetite so that in boggy environments they can keep themselves oriented towards the magnetic pole, so they don't sink down too low or sink where they need to be adaptively. And if you found stuff like that on Mars, or stuff that is, or organisms in very dry environments typically coat themselves, microbial communities, with these kind of darker pigments so that they can protect themselves from the sun. It's kind of their only sunscreen. So if you go out in the desert, you will find these microbial communities that are kind of blackened. So you'd look for stuff like that.
So it sounds like, Carol, are you saying that that is within the scope of what Perseverance rover is doing, or one would like it to be? And one would like it to be. Okay, so
you did it the way I would like you to do it, using tentative, not defining criteria.
Okay, so if I understand Carol right, we might just miss life's signature if we don't look for life the right way. And Haley, what do you think? Perseverance rover is digging away right now. Are we going to have to say, no, go back to the field and we're going to redefine your terms? No, but could we miss it? Could we miss it?
So I'm going to take perhaps an unpopular opinion here and say, not only is it possible that Perseverance could miss life on Mars, I'm going to say that it is almost certain that Perseverance will miss finding life on Mars. And I think one of the strengths of this mission is that Perseverance is caching samples for eventual return to Earth. And so that means we're going to have an archive of material that we can continue to investigate as our ideas around life evolve and change. So I think, will the rover itself miss finding life on Mars? Almost certainly. Will the mission? I think that's why we have this wealth of information that we're caching to bring back to Earth.
You know what I like about that answer, although you framed it as a disappointing answer, is it keeps humans in the loop. Because at least we still need humans on one side to analyze some of this. Okay, let's look at the answer to the poll question. And then I'll have a final question, and then audience, take it away. All right, so the poll results. Remember, the question was, which of the following is definitely not alive? I don't know if the audience can see these. Can you see these results? Maybe not. You can. Okay. Well, anyway, so not alive virus. No, most people looks like think that virus is probably alive. Rock. No, definitely not alive. They may have considered their answer after they they heard Haley. AI, maybe. Fire, none of the above, and all the above, all in a dead heat. So the rock was the one example of something most definitely not alive. And Haley has things to say about that. And she did say that. Well, finally, before we get to the audience questions, I wonder if we had the oh God, I don't want to say the word definition. If we looked for life, if we considered life in a more nimble, open-minded way, in the way that would bring a big smile to Carol's face, where would we look for life? Right now, some of the top spots are Mars and the subsurface ocean of Jupiter's moon, Europa, maybe Venus. Does that list change, Carol and Haley? Where would we go?
If you're looking for life that's really different than our form of life, Titan's your goal.
Titan.
It's full of organic molecules, but it's got very low temperature, basically no liquid water. It's got a very different pressure. It's got oceans of methane and what are the oceans? I think it's mostly, is it ethane? Methane?
Mix of hydrocarbons.
Yeah, mix of hydrocarbons. Basically, oceans are small, I don't know whether they're oceans, but they're big lakes of it, and rivers, and a really thick atmosphere full of organic molecules. If you really want to find something that's different, our form of life, using the kind of carbon chemistry we have, wouldn't be there.
Yeah, I like that. Great. Okay, Titan. That's already thinking outside of what I would be thinking outside of my preconceived notions, including Titan. And Haley, how about you?
Sure. So I'm going to give two answers here. So something close to home that's tractable with our current technology, perhaps maybe within the next decade. I would say that the subsurface of Mars is probably one of the most promising environments with which we could say, hopefully with some certainty, whether there's evidence of life there within the next decade. To get really creative and to go way out there, I'd like to think about things in an entirely different time span. So thinking about things on a scale of time and space that we don't usually consider to be consistent with our notions of life. And so thinking about things like even gravity waves or the cosmic background radiation. And so to really move beyond our conception of what we think of life on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
You get energy gradients, right?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of a gravitational energy gradient is something that a lot of people have they're kind of afraid of because they don't even know what it would look like. But it's a really novel thought for a novel type of life. Yeah.
Great answers. Okay, questions from the audience, and I see Frank is here to read the questions. Is that right?
Yes, I'm gonna we have selected with Rebecca some questions. We got more than 60 questions, so I'm sorry we're not gonna be able to answer to all of them, but we try to put them together. So we made up questions based on your questions. So thank you very much for sending those questions. So one of the questions we got was in an attempt to define life, whether or not the communication is an important part of life. Can we say that life needs to somehow be able to communicate? Carol, do you want to answer to this one?
So I think that that's a really interesting question. It depends what you mean by communicate. Certainly, inside organisms are going to be complex. There's no question that complexity is involved in organisms. And what's inside an organism that manages to do metabolism or Darwinian evolution has to communicate. So you've already got communication internally in any organism. I think you're not asking about that, but signals are your body is just full of signals all the time, not just your brain, hormones, etc. But I think that what you're asking is, does there need to be more than one of them? And does it need to have some sort of social relationship with others. Is that, I think, the question it might be?
Did not ask this question, but that's the way I will have
That's the way you would interpret it.
Yeah.
And I'm not so sure. I think, I think I think that I can imagine an organism that is created and it's able to extract energy from the environment, maintain its organization, and never reproduces because it has an environment that doesn't require it to constantly adapt to changing circumstances. So as I said, it's our Goldilocks planet that we have here, which is just right. It doesn't change so fast, everything goes extinct, and it doesn't change so slowly that there's no need for adaptation. So
I think Frank will have another question. It's an excellent answer. If you don't mind my just jumping in, because I want to see if this is such a central question to SETI. Haley, do you have an response to that that question from the audience? Is communication, should that be included in the definition?
I think signaling is a fundamental property. At least life as we know it, some kind of signaling and communication with the environment or internally, or keeping some sort of centralized compartment that's different inside than outside. And that requires some level of communication. But communication in the sense of intelligence, I think, is a whole other question. And I think that's a whole other debate. Does life require intelligence to be considered life? And I think that depends on how you define intelligence. And I think that's a whole other debate that we could get into here. But I would say on the face of it, for something to be alive, it does not need to conform to our kind of canonical definition of intelligence.
Look at a bacterium.
Well, and certainly the discovery of how intelligent octopuses are it really changed our notion of what is intelligence. Frank, do we have a couple more?
Yes, we have 6 questions. So let's try to give some very short answers. And because I would love to go to some of those questions. So one of them is, did DNA life or life on Earth that we know at the moment arise by abiogenesis only once, or does this happen multiple times? And what did we learn from this?
That's actually my shadow biosphere.
Okay.
So let me address that one. So I have argued we have no reason to think it originated just once. Why? Because clearly, if life did originate from Earth, and panspermia might be true, we might all be Martians, but if life did originate in Earth, the chemical and physical conditions were there for life, and there's no reason. We know that there are delivered by meteorites suites of amino acids that are different than the 20 that we use. We know that there are some nucleobases that are easy to make that are slightly different than the ones that we use. So there's no reason to think that there wouldn't have been sort of different, not too different, but different kinds of DNA, nucleic acid, and different kinds of proteins in the first organisms. And that's what I call the shadow biosphere. Could these organisms still be with us today? We wouldn't be able to recognize them with the tools that biologists currently use to explore the microbial world.
What's your view, Ali, on this topic?
And I don't think there's any reason to believe that it only happened once. And I think it's actually much more probable to think about probably a whole bunch of, Darwin's warm little ponds all over the early Earth with slightly different conditions. And thinking about life as the inevitable thermodynamic consequence of a certain set of physiochemical conditions. And I don't think there's any reason to believe there only needed to be one certain set.
Okay, so I have a very short question. You didn't want to talk about viruses, so now someone wants you to talk about prions.
Oh,
so maybe you should describe first what is a prion and maybe explain to us whether or not you think prions are alive. Ali, you want to start with that?
Sure. So I think this goes back to the idea of what is minimal life. And I don't think we really have a good idea of what minimal life is. And so we talk about these biological elements that interfere with life, that can end life, that can change life, that can, change how we interact. But are these elements themselves alive? I think taken in complete isolation, they don't satisfy many of the criteria we associate with life. But is it really a good idea can we look at these things in complete isolation? And
can you give a quick definition of what a prion is, or people I think associate with mad cow disease, certainly,
Yeah.
but just a quick one. And again, apologies, Carol, to the word definition, but can you just remind us what a prion is?
Sure. So a prion is basically a specific type of protein, and the way we generally think of them are things like prion diseases that affect humans and animals, in which case these specific types of proteins can trigger a normal protein to fold abnormally. So it's a protein that interacts with our proteins in bad ways, and they interfere with life processes by doing that. So it's a biological element, similar to how a virus is a biological element that doesn't currently satisfy all of the criteria that we tend to associate with a self-contained organism.
So can I respond to that just quickly? Prions are interesting because they're the metabolic definitions equivalent of viruses for the Darwinian definition. Because what prions do is they change the folding and they replicate this change in folding. So you have basically a metabolic system without a genetic system. And in viruses, you basically have a genetic system without a metabolic system. It has to parasitize the cell. So I think for somebody who would, there are people who have Darwinian definitions of life who would they would kill to maintain that viruses are alive. And I think that the same is the case for prions with metabolic definitions.
That's a great description. I think we have two more questions from Frank, and both, of course, prions and viruses have the potential for upending our lives thoroughly. Frank, I think two more, right? Before
two more. So one of them, I really wanted someone to ask this question, so I'm kind of happy we have it. So we are evolving, but we're also creating computers, and those computers are getting smarter, and one day maybe one of them will be smarter than the human being, the singularity. So in this case, could we say that artificial intelligence in the future will be alive? And tell us what you think about that.
Do you want me to go first, or?
Ali, go ahead if you want.
Sure. So I think this is a rewording of the question about does life require intelligence? And I would argue that if the only thing that's defining these highly evolved artificial intelligence is that it's smarter than a human, I think that in itself is a pretty restrictive definition of being alive.
But if it were sentient, and if it were conscious and it had emotions, would it then be alive?
Is consciousness, or the demonstration of consciousness, then a requirement for something to be alive? Or if that is in and of itself such an extreme embodiment of life that we can forget about all of the other components?
Carol.
Yes. So the real question is not whether life requires intelligence, but whether intelligence requires life. That's the real question. And philosophers have worried about consciousness and intelligence. They aren't necessarily the same. I think Katie was hinting at that. Consciousness is a kind of sentience, kind of self-awareness. It's not clear that you have to be self-aware to solve problems. Lots of computers are good at solving problems. Whether or not they're aware that they're solving problems is a really different question. The question of self-awareness is what the question of sentience is. And I think a lot of people don't realize how stupid the current computers are. They don't have any generalized intelligence. So you have Deep Blue and these various checker playing and chess playing computers, and they're really, really good at a very narrowly defined problems. But Deep Blue can't do anything about answering the question of whether life should be defined or even discussing it. And so I think, we have thought I actually started out working on artificial intelligence. I actually programmed before I became a philosopher. I worked in computer science. I was a software engineer. And one of the things that really struck me is that a lot of the hype about expert systems, which are experts, they can be good at medicine, but they aren't good at being creative. And so, you know, the problem is I'm not so sure that we're going to be able to create a kind of robotic intelligence with the kind of generality of human intelligence. And then there's the question of consciousness, which I think is a separate question.
Of course, you could also add an ellipsis to this and just say yet. They are not there yet. And judging by the poll that we took, the vast majority of the audience tonight is not willing to rule out that artificial intelligence may be alive, or one day may be alive. But that is another thorny question. So I think there's one more, Frank, right?
Yeah, one more question. I think easier than the previous one. So someone is interested in hearing your thoughts about searching for life on exoplanets. Since those signs of life will be far less definitive than the problematic definition that you have described, will it be a way to have a clear line of evidence that could confirm the existence of life on exoplanets?
I think a clear definitive line of evidence, no. I don't think that we have that for searching for life on any planet, let alone an exoplanet. But convincing or intriguing lines of evidence, sure. I think it comes down to disequilibrium and looking for things that are unexpected. So looking for things that are out of equilibrium. So gases in the atmosphere that we wouldn't expect to be there based on what we know about the geochemistry.
Anomalies.
Yes, Carol. looking for those things that are unexpected.
That's all for the questions. Thank you.
Lovely. Well, I want to thank our guests and invite Bill Diamond back on, Carol Cleland and Haley Sapers. It was such a pleasure to talk to both of you. Of course, I always wish we had more time, but thank you for a riveting conversation, and to our audience, of course, for being here. And Bill, good to see you again. Take it away.
Yeah, wow. What a night. So thank you so much, Molly and Haley and Carol. So in spite of our slow start, you know, that was really an amazing discussion, and it gives us all a lot to think about and to contemplate. Not least, we learned from Haley that apparently a rock is alive. So that was something new for me, but really a great discussion, lively, obviously a lot of interest from the audience in this topic. And yes, we could go all night and into the next weeks and months. I will say that the life forms participating in tonight's discussion are just a little bit passionate about the topic. Quite apparently. So it's also wonderful to know that so many in our audience have apparently attended these talks before, because without any prompting, which we usually do, many of you let us know where you're joining us from, and we always love to know that. And once again, we reached a global audience this evening, and it proves, I think, as always, that it is curiosity that unites us as human beings, regardless of where we come from. And tonight we had people joining us from Italy, Brazil, Australia, Mexico, Canada, Macedonia, Pakistan, Singapore, Nepal, Japan, Turkey, Argentina, Guatemala, India, Malaysia, Spain, Colombia, Poland, St. Kitts and Nevis, Serbia, Russia, and Chile. So just an amazing international set of guests. And in the US, which is kind of a collection of small individual countries, we had folks joining us, of course, from California, but also Minnesota, Washington, New York, Florida, Pennsylvania, Idaho, Maryland, New Jersey, Virginia, Washington, Texas, Ohio, North Carolina, Montana, Colorado, Hawaii, Oklahoma, Delaware, Arizona, Wisconsin, Illinois, Kentucky, and Wyoming. So fantastic. And thank you all for coming. And again, thanks for your patience tonight. So before closing, just a quick reminder that the SETI Talks is a production of the SETI Institute in Mountain View, California. We are a nonprofit research and education institution whose mission is to lead humanity's quest to understand the origins and prevalence of life and intelligence in the universe, and to share this knowledge to inspire and guide present and future generations. Our SETI Talks lecture series is supported in part by donations from the public, from friends of science like you. We bring these lectures and other events to you at no cost, but we're very grateful for any and all donations that allow us to continue bringing the stories of extraordinary science and exploration to you. So we invite you to join our quest and become part of our community. You can visit us at SETI.org for more information, and also to keep track of the SETI Talks lecture series and see what's coming up. Make a donation if you're so inclined, and of course, sign up for our monthly science newsletter that we call Journey. So thanks again to all of you for being with us today. And thanks to our guest speakers, Haley and Carol, and to Molly for her inspiring moderation. I also want to thank Rebecca, Frank, Lee, Beth, Jasmine, and the rest of the team at the SETI Institute who make the SETI Talk series possible. Don't forget to visit our YouTube channel and tour the amazing array of lectures, presentations, and other videos. All our past SETI Talks lectures are on our YouTube channel. And if you're interested in sponsoring a SETI Talks event, please contact us to learn more. The email address you can reach out to is info@seti.org. Remember, the work we do at the SETI Institute is for all of humankind, so don't just stand by and watch. Come and join us at SETI.org. Be part of our team. The search for life beyond Earth is a journey of ultimate discovery, and we invite you to come along. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time.